before we start. Lord God, we come before you today just 1 week until Christmas. We are nearing the end of our Advent waiting season, and we anxiously await your coming on Christmas. We bless you and we thank you for the many gifts that you give us, especially at this time of year, the gift of your Son. The gift of your Son who brings love and hope into the world. Love and hope that we need to share with each other, and love and hope that we need to express in all that we do. Lord, as we continue our study of Paul the Apostle this evening, we ask that you open our hearts and our minds so that what we learn may make us better disciples, that we may be bearers of your gospel to not only those who have heard the gospel story already, but especially as Paul did to those who were hearing it for the first time and had heard nothing at all like it. Help us to be your disciples to all people. And we pray in the name of that same Savior, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, this is great to see so many people. I wasn't sure with, people tell me, oh, I'd be there, but I have Christmas shopping to do, and I have that to do, and, it's that time of year when all that's going on. So for those of you who are used to watching the back monitor, let me just try to explain. We have had an issue for some time that when we try to live stream, it's fine if we live stream whoever the speaker is, but there's a switch back there where you can flick the switch and it's supposed to put the slides on the TV screen. And we've had an issue for a while where it was only doing like the top half of the screen. So, Dean, how long has that been going on?
Months.
Yeah, it's been, so all of a sudden today, they were ready to work on it. So at one time we had both of our tech guys up here doing it because not only could they not figure out how to fix that, but we lost this monitor completely. And so they were changing resolutions and doing this and that, and it was kind of like, all the tech people in the world trying to fix this problem. And I had to go somewhere, so I left and I said, whatever happens, just be sure that this one works, because this is the bigger one. And so I came in about 4:30 and both of them were working. And I talked to them downstairs and they said, we can't fix the problem with that. We may have to go in behind the walls with the wiring, and it has something to do with the HDMI signal being split between digital and analog, and so all this. And I said, well, Hope University will be taking 2 weeks off. Well, this might take longer than 2 weeks. So I said, well, then we might have to wait until the summer break before we actually do that, so that we're not in here with dust coming down and who knows what it is they're going to have to do. But it's beyond my technical knowledge. So anyway, I guess they took me literally because this one works and that one doesn't. I mean, I really didn't mean that literally. I really would like to have both of them, but we do have this one working. So, and who knows? I mean, at some point I may push a slide and it won't advance and we won't have any of them. Okay, so this will be the end of our first semester. And let me just clarify, because in the News in the Pews this past week it said, see you in the spring. Well, that really means see you in the spring semester. We don't mean see you like in April. We're not taking off that long. We're just taking 2 weeks off, and then we'll be coming back. And beginning with January I want to say it's about the 7th and 8th, I believe. That Tuesday and Wednesday, I'll be starting with 1 Thessalonians, and we'll do 1 week of a academic study on the book, and then Pastor Ronnie the next week will do a Bible study on the book, and he and I were talking some about that today. And that's going to be pretty much what our entire spring semester is going to be. Notice it's called the spring semester, but it begins in January, because January here feels like spring everywhere else, okay? So we can say that. Except for during Lent, and then Pastor Dean is going to do a book study for 1 week, and then after that's going to continue covering the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so any questions on where we go from here forward? So if you come here next Tuesday, on Christmas night, we won't be here. Yeah, okay, if you come to work on the TV, I'll let you in. Okay, so we're going to continue on. Again, this is our last week of background on Paul. I know for some it might feel like we have been doing this forever. This is really only our 6th session. And again, for anyone who's missing any of the weeks of notes, if you just let me know, you can leave me a note if you want to with what weeks you're missing. I have a stack of them down in my office, and I can give you access to any week at all that you want. We're going to look tonight at, the topic that we're going to look at tonight for Paul is going to be, what did Paul do? And so you'll see that that's what we have on our slides. We have a lot of slides. As you see, you have a 7-page handout. So I really tried to look carefully at what passages of Scripture. I want to look at them all. It's so hard for me to limit it and say we just don't have time to look at that because, I study it and I read it in Scripture and I get so excited because it's like, oh yes, now it makes sense what this means and what this says, but we don't have time to read them all. So in some cases, I'm just going to tell you what they are, and then you might have to write it down and then look at it later. As usual, give you kind of an advance notice of what the study questions are, if we do indeed have time to do the study questions at the end. Our first one says, do you belong to or participate in any fictive families? We're going to look at what a fictive family is and what that would have meant for Paul. If so, what are the benefits and the problems of such family groupings? And then what do you think of Paul's use of what we're going to call the fictive family model? In what ways might Paul and his message have appeared to threaten the Roman Empire? I think we've already seen some of that in what we've talked about already. And obviously, even in the Gospels, you see that what the good news has may come as not so good news to the people who are already the authorities. How does that view of Paul affect your understanding of him? Number 3, how did Paul nurture his congregations? We're going to talk about that. Not only how he established them, but then what did he do to nurture them and keep them going as young, fledgling congregations? Compare Paul's letters with the way you nurture your own social networks. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about letters, which makes sense that before we actually get into the letters, we're going to spend some time really talking about that genre and what it looked like, and compare it especially to other letters that would have been written at the same time. And then what role does the collection play in Paul's goal of networking? That's the last thing we're going to talk about. It's going to be the collection that he took up. So our overriding question this evening is, what did Paul do? Sounds like such a simple question to have 7 pages of notes about. Because in one way, I could just show this first bullet and we could go home for the night. This is what Paul did. Most important, utmost to Paul, was to announce the good news of what God had done in Jesus. Period. Everything else is subservient to this. Paul is about announcing this good news. He was fundamentally changed by what happened on the road to Damascus, and this becomes his goal, is to announce the good news of what God has done in Jesus. And he believed that God did this first to the Judean people. So he acknowledges his own roots, of his people that go all the way back to Abraham. And he looks at that people and he says, God has been at work in this people. So he didn't, as we've said before, and we really have to hear this, he in no way stepped away from his roots. He tried to incorporate his roots into this new movement. So everything that he felt as a Judean, he thought was very important. And he said that's where God was at work first. But he felt a special mission to non-Judean people. So he quickly left Israel, the place where the Jewish people would have been found in greatest concentration, and took this good news to people who were not of a background of anything of the people of Israel. Paul saw himself as participating in God's long-standing plan that through the witness of Israel, the nations would stream into Jerusalem and to the God of Israel. So still, and fundamentally for him, it's all about coming through the Jewish people. Now, we know that he felt strongly that by becoming part of that didn't mean you had to do all the things that you had to do to become a Judean. The circumcision and all of the things. The Council of Jerusalem kind of narrowed that down to here are the 4 things you have to do. But he really was not able to separate himself from all of his upbringing, that this was still part of the Judean people. How? Well, the 21st century, we're driven by electronic social media, right? And I think that we've seen in our lifetimes just an unbelievable mushrooming of what that means. All of those devices and all the things we use and how fast news travels now. You remember when we had to wait for the 6 o'clock news to come on to find out anything that went on. And you probably didn't even get a hint about it until then. Now every time your phone buzzes, you're wondering, is this a headline I'm getting from somewhere? The big story today? Who was it who passed away today? Penny Marshall. Okay. Laverne and Shirley. Although talking to the younger people on our staff, they're saying, who's Laverne and Shirley? You know? They knew who Penny Marshall was, but they were looking at something else that was more modern. I'm like, what is that? I don't know. I know Laverne and Shirley. And I'm like, Laverne and Shirley, it was a spinoff from Happy Days. What was that? Ron Howard, the director. Well, he was an actor before he was a director. I said he was Opie, and they go, you mean Opie from something? And I'm like, no, Opie from, Andy Griffith. Oh, I don't know what that is. So having this conversation with some of the people downstairs was like we were speaking different languages. Paul created his own social network spread through disparate lands. Okay, it pales in comparison to our ability to spread news now. But as I said, ours has grown just exponentially in the last few years. His social network is really unbelievable when you look back and you think of the time and what he was able to do and the way he was able to keep communications going among all these various places before Twitter, before Facebook, before posting pictures on Instagram or any of that. And he was doing this through varying economic and social situations. There were some places where there was wealth, places where there was not wealth. Places where the social situation people, you had the haves and you have the have-nots, and all of this is coming together somehow under this one person, Paul. Paul is just the most incredible person. I mean, I think that the one thing in me studying for these 6 weeks and these 6 sessions, and I've had plenty of courses in Paul, but it's like I have rediscovered or have a renewed admiration for the unbelievable work that this one single man did. Just truly incredible. And then also, there's a lot of pre-Christ identities that ran the gamut of all those first century religious possibilities. We talked about that last week. All the philosophies that were going around, the religions. You had the Greek religions from when the Greek Empire was at its peak in the centuries before Christ, or BCE, all the way to the Roman Empire. And then you have Paul somehow trying to bring those people into this understanding. So that's why my prayer today, I'm thinking, if you meet somebody today who has never heard the gospel, that's what Paul did all the time. Paul was meeting people who didn't know anything about the Hebrew Bible or anything about Jesus. So they were like fresh, and those were the people he was meeting time and again. To Paul, all were in Christ, a social network all related to each other. Neither Greek nor Jew, slave or free, right? His passage, all that's gone. We're all drawn together by this one identity in Christ. So the church was the heart of what Paul did. Paul gathered people into these churches through formal preaching, through conversations in the workplace and home. So these were worshiping, serving, and supporting grouping of people. And again, we're not talking about church like this big church here. We're going back to the true meaning of church, where church is a gathering of people. Okay? On the macro level, or on the upper level, the big level, sort of a bird's eye view, each church was a sign of God's end-time justifying activity that had already started in Jesus. Paul nurtured these churches by personal visits by his co-workers, by letters, and by a monetary collection. We're going to look at each one of those things individually tonight. And he didn't just go from city to city, but he tended to focus on the large cities. He went from large city to large city, and typically only to new locations. I have down here that I wanted to read. I didn't bring my Bible. I want to read Romans chapter 15, verse 20. Whoever uses this Bible had a real thing for Galatians, because this is like cracked open to Galatians. Okay, Romans 15, verse 20. He says in chapter 15, verse 20, "It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation." I mean, think about what that means. It's easy to go where someone's already sort of greased the skids for you, right? Think how hard that is. I spent the afternoon, part of my conversation was with a missionary, like a true missionary, who would go to Africa and places like that. And he was talking about, again, meeting peoples who have never heard the story. But Paul says, I really want to do that. That's what I want to do. I want to go to these places. Okay. Once a house church was able to function on its own, Paul left, traveling on the major commercial routes to somewhere else. So you kind of picture him getting them going, getting a group going, getting it started, feeling like they're set to go, and then moving on to another location. The selective process of where to found congregations, and as I said, he went from one large city to another. We hear these names, and unless you've been over there visiting and visited the ruins of them, I mean, they're not cities that are around today. Corinth is not something that's there today, but you can see the ruins and see that it was a big city. Was it Corinth or was it Ephesus that had the 3-story library? Ephesus. I couldn't remember which one it was, but Ephesus has the remains of what appears to be a 3-story library. I mean, just picture that at this time, to have a building of that sort. That says a lot about how big the city would have been. Then on the micro level, okay, in other words, what's going on inside this building, Paul really likes using the word to build up. Okay? The Greek is oikodome, which means to build up. Paul would say in Romans 15:19 that he has fully proclaimed the good news of Christ. He uses this Greek word to build up in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Thessalonians, Romans, and 2 Thessalonians. That Greek word is there to build up. The one quote from all of those that I really liked was his quote where he says, "Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up." And that is that Greek word, to build up. So I like this Greek word because you picture building a church, right? Building it up. But in this term here, we're using not building a building to build it up, but building what's going on inside that. Okay, let's see if there's anything else. Each time he would found a church, and that church was charged with taking care of the people around it. Okay, and typically, okay, here is what a house may have looked like. Okay, so you can kind of picture this going on. If the weather's nice, you could be out in the courtyard. But I want to talk about what the house church was like, because that's what this would have been. These would have been house churches. And hopefully this is a word that you have seen before, ecclesia. We translate that Greek word as church, okay? But that word is not just a New Testament word. It goes all the way back to the 5th century BCE, and it really means an assembly. It was used in military assemblies, army assemblies. It also was used to refer to Israel when it assembled to hear the word of God way back in Deuteronomy and 1 Kings, okay? So this Greek word ecclesia, meaning church, is not, again, a building, but a gathering of people. Paul applied the term to both local congregations and all congregations. We would look at it now by saying the local church and the Catholic Church or the universal church. He already had kind of an understanding of it back then. He would use this to refer to whatever was being built in Corinth and whatever was being built in Philippi. As far as by build, I mean a group coming together and forming together as a church. But then he also realized that all of them together were part of the same concept. And I had all these things. 1 Corinthians 1:2, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 Corinthians 12, 2 Corinthians 1, Romans 16. All the places where he uses this terminology. As we said, Paul's churches did not have buildings. They typically would have been in a house. It wasn't until the second half of the 2nd century that the Christians began to dedicate homes solely to worship. Even then, they're not building separate buildings, but by then, if you were the person whose house was typically holding worship, picture a what do they call that when you go to different people's houses and everyone, like a progressive dinner. So kind of picture early on it may have been a progressive dinner. Okay, I'll have the first Sunday of the month and you'll have the second Sunday of the month, and we'll kind of go around. Well, eventually, I guess people said, you know, my house isn't big enough to hold all these people. So we might say, okay, we're going to be at the tortoise house, and we're going to just use your house every week. Is that okay? And so by the second half of the second century, there were people's homes that were dedicated solely to worship. So that's the beginning of the idea of there being a dedicated place to do the worship. Now remember, they're still going to synagogues on Saturday, and then they're celebrating the Lord's Supper in some form on Sunday. The first separate church building isn't really identified until the year 314. Paul died, remember, in 62, so long time after Paul, before we have anything like that. Same picture, because I couldn't find anything better to put there, so I just put the same picture back up. Same picture here, because again, I couldn't find anything better. While synagogues might remain open to Christ believers, it was a natural progression to celebrate their rites at home. They wouldn't have had any money to rent space. It would have been expensive to rent space. And you can imagine if you do this week in and week out, that would be very expensive. So they would go to the synagogue on Saturday, and then anyone who was a Christ believer would come to someone's home to celebrate on Sunday. Greeks and Romans had already practiced home-based religion, so there were already models there. Remember last week I talked about the home religions, how there were places in the home that people might have dedicated it to the gods of their family. They might have a dedicated room or a dedicated space where they would remember that. Now, these three terms right here are really the Latin terms that refer to the parts or the kinds of houses they would be. A domus was a private home for wealthier or more prominent people. It would have several rooms clustered around a central atrium with expensive furnishing and decorations in an enclosed and columned yard. This would have been a domus, okay? In other words, a full-blown house. As your numbers got bigger, this was the kind of place that you would have to come. Now, the triclinium was the dining room inside the house. So that would have been the largest house that you would have to be able to hold 9 or 10 people reclining on couches, or without couches, about 20 people. So if you're getting more people, take the couches out, okay? Put some beanbag chairs in, get everybody in there. If the atrium was used, the gathering could comfortably accommodate 30 to 50 people. As you see, you'd have the room outside if you did that. So the most comfortable place to be and would have been a domus, and especially a domus that had a nice big triclinium. So in other words, instead of looking at number of bedrooms, you want a house with a big dining room. Those were the best ones to have a house church in. The insula was basically an apartment building. Okay, now apartment buildings typically aren't going to have the same kind of space. Now the apartment building would have rows of shops on the ground floor. Okay, makes sense, right? You have and you still can go into the downtowns of major cities, even in our own country, and see the same kind of setup. Okay, picture Katie Bell's. You have the stores on the bottom level. You go up to the upper level, then that's where you would have an apartment. Typically, the apartment are the people who ran the shop downstairs, or they may have had a place in the back. But there was a couple of problems. Typically, the insula was too small to accommodate large groups. They also didn't have a kitchen or toilet facilities. So it's kind of hard to be welcoming to your congregation when you say, be sure you use the facilities before you come to church, because we can't accommodate you here. At least 5 house churches are identified in Romans 16, and most were probably the domus, but some could have been insulae. So there would have been some. Again, it really depended on what was going on, how many people there were. You could see how a church could easily outgrow an apartment building and need to move into a larger house. But again, it's hard for us to imagine these kinds of problems, okay, as they try to pick out which kind of house they're going to be going to. All right, moving on. This was our first question. The church is a fictive family. So first of all, if we look at what the definition of a fictive family, the fictive family is basically not a natural-born family, but it's a surrogate or substitute family. It's a social group whose members are related to one another, not by birth, not by marriage, but who nevertheless, first of all, employ kinship terminology to describe their relationships. So in other words, they talk about each other as being brothers and sisters, even though they're not really brothers and sisters, okay? But in their eyes, they are brothers and sisters because they see themselves as a family. And secondly, they expect family-like behavior to characterize their interaction among group members. So if you're part of a fictive family, even though this isn't your natural-born family, you are to treat everyone as if they're your brother and sister, because they are your brother and sister in this fictive family. So what is it that pulled this family together, this fictive family? It was a common belief in Jesus and the common community life they shared. So remember we talked last time how people would have gathered in neighborhoods with like people, people who came from certain countries or so on, just like we would in our big cities today when people immigrated to this country. Well, now they may not come from the same neighborhood. They might come from all over the city because it's Jesus that's bringing them all together. Okay, so we talked about the threat this could have been to the Roman Empire. As long as everything's going place in this neighborhood, that's okay. But once you start bringing people from all the neighborhoods together, well, this could be a force to be reckoned with. Ancient Mediterranean people received their identities from their families. Thus, a new fictive family meant a reshuffling. So instead of being your natural-born family, all these people could come together from lots of different kinds of families to share this fictive family, or this family who shares these common values. Unlike the Greco-Roman families, which were the building blocks of society under the emperor, these were sisters and brothers. So again, to other people's ears, if you don't understand what a fictive family is, you mean, what do you mean they're your brother? They're not your brother. You're not blood relationship, but no, they truly were brothers and sisters as part of this family. The place of honor. Remember honor and shame? We talked about honor and shame before. Well, honor had a place in this too. You were to treat everyone with honor in your family. So families attached to each other honor. And so you were to give honor, and everyone was to give everyone else honor. Paul saw honor as something to give to family members rather than taking it. So his emphasis was on giving honor to the people who were in your family. And remember, as I speak of family here, I'm talking of the fictive family, what would become to be called the Christian family.
Was the fictive family unique to the Christ followers?
No. There would have been all kinds of fictive families. So the question was, is fictive families common to just the Christ believers? And that, no. So there were other things that were going, but the Christ movement was getting bigger and bigger as time went on. Okay, but it associated these same ideas of this fictive family. Okay, let's see. 3 potential problems of the house or fictive church family. Meeting in separate homes could lead to different identities. You see how that could happen? If you take a group and you say, well, we can't meet here, let's meet at 3 different places. Unless someone is seeing to it that everyone's still doing the same thing, a year later, each of those 3 places could be doing something different than the other ones are. And Paul speaks of that in 1 Corinthians. Okay, this problem of having separate identities or different identities going on. Secondly, the Domus house churches could allow social and economic disparities, and Paul talks about that as well. So you can imagine the homeowner typically would be a person of wealth because they had the Domus. But you're bringing Christ believers from all over the city. So you bring someone who's very poor into that. Well, you need to be careful that you're not treating them any differently because Jesus wouldn't have treated them any differently. So that could have been a new concept because they're coming from a neighborhood that's on the other side of the tracks. But they're coming now to this Domus or this Christ family. And so we have to be careful that we're not treating people from different backgrounds differently. And it was this household model that paved the way for a hierarchical model of authority under a bishop, paterfamilias, bishop meaning a male person. You can find a reference to that in 1 Timothy 3:15. Remember, this is long after Paul. We don't have any kind of idea of a hierarchical model. But you can see how, if you so picture this, you start off meeting in a lot of homes. Now all of a sudden you all are meeting in my home every week, week in and week out. Who are you eventually going to look at as being the boss? It's my house, right? I'll set the rules. I'll say what time we come, what time we're going to leave. You know, I'll say what we're going to be doing while we're there, because in addition to celebrating the Lord's Supper, they would have meals and things like that as well. So it gets into a hierarchical model where you have somebody who's in charge. Again, long after Paul, but you can already see if you look in 1 Timothy, some little hints of what that's going to look like. Well, how could non-believers, the people who were around, so picture the next door neighbor who's watching people coming into this house. Okay, I'm sure they were watching all this going on and seeing all the cars pull up and wondering what's going on. They didn't have cars back then, but you get the idea. Look at all the people going in that house over there. There must be something going on in that house. I wonder what's going on in that house. So what could non-believers have thought? Well, there's 4 possible models to view this new phenomenon, and this is by Richard Askell. One is the synagogue model. We're going to talk briefly about each of these 4. Let's see. Yeah, we're not going to really talk about that now. So in other words, they could have just thought, okay, they were meeting at the synagogue yesterday, now they're coming here, so this is kind of an extension of what's going on at the synagogue. They could have thought, oh, this is just a different philosophical school. Remember last week we talked about how philosophy was so important in first century. So these are people getting together to have philosophical discussions. Those mystery religions, oh, there's something mysterious going on there. All right. It's easy to think that whenever you see a lot of cars or a lot of people showing up at your next door neighbor. Well, there's something mysterious going on over there. I wonder exactly what that is. And especially if you would hear any of the wording, it sounds like, this is my body, this is my blood. You can see how this could be seen as being something kind of mysterious. And then voluntary associations, which again, these are all, especially this last one, this is something that would have been around anyway. This is the easiest model to see if you look in the congregations in Philippi and Thessalonica. Okay, people come together of free will, they're accepted by free will, and there's mutual acceptance created certain obligations on both parties. This existed for centuries in the Roman Empire. Okay, the term collegia would have also been used for that, people coming together voluntarily. The empire, though, was wary of them and went through periods of banning them. Again, keep everybody divided. You know, divide and conquer. If you let people come together, especially voluntarily, you could be inviting trouble. I was going to read a listing of similarities and differences, but I don't really want to take the time to do that because, and what's already a packed night, I don't see that it's necessarily going to help us. All of these could be found in households in the first centuries, not just for Christ believers, but for other organizations that were meeting in people's homes. And again, the potential danger for Christ believers is the fact that it was not neighborhoods or ethnicity that united them, but rather a belief system which made them look political and hence potentially dangerous. These weren't just neighborhood block parties. This was a party that was drawing people from all around. So very different from dividing. This is uniting. And if you want to have power, it's never a good idea for people to unite doing something you're not sure what they're doing. Yes, Peggy.
I know I'm going to be opening a can of worms here.
Okay, open it up. Let's see if we can.
Do you think in the house churches that there were women involved? Or was it only the men gathering?
We know that women would have been involved, and we're going to see later on that Paul relied on several really important key women to deliver his letters. So, and they would have been in there because they would have been reading the letters. So women would have not only been involved, but they would have been in very important positions.
But then Paul said they had to keep quiet in church.
After they read the letter, then they had to be keep quiet.
Right. Which is the basis of why the Missouri Synod does not allow women to serve on their vestry council, even read in the pulpit in some places.
And you know, I would love to have Paul come in here and explain that to us, because that would be really a great question to ask him. But we will see later on that women were very important to him. He had some really key, and we already know that Jesus had women who were very important to him as well. So again, it's whenever you take something, especially a verse or one thing that's being said, and you apply that to all situations, it's always dangerous. So I don't know that Paul would necessarily say, yeah, that's the way it should be. And remember, a lot of Paul, too, is very apocryphal. He's thinking about the end times. Let's don't upset the cart. Let's just do things the easiest way they should be. And let's, women already had, a certain place in society. And so if you start making things too bad, well, hey, the end's coming here. It might be next week, so let's just go ahead and take care of things right now. But we will see that if you use Paul as an authority for women not having an important place, that wouldn't be Paul. I mean, if he's going to count on them to deliver this letter to a church, we're going to see when we talk about letter delivery and how dangerous it was to even ensure it was going to get there. He's putting a lot of trust in women.
Was female inclusion within Paul's unique to the Christ followers or all the other groups?
Well, you're always going to find some groups who would have women in certain positions, but they would have been in the minority. Okay, by and large, in the society at this time, women would not have had great positions of leadership or authority.
Going back to when you're talking about people, a neighbor seeing this grouping of people, they would be somewhat unique just on that basis.
They could be. The fact that women were coming as well as men. Now, the women always come in the back door, though. Maybe not.
There are some theories also that the women were not allowed in the inner worship area of the synagogue. And once they were incorporated within worship, they took free reign and women.
See, that's what happens. I
Yep,
know.
yep,
Yeah.
right. And I am a woman, so I can say that.
And since I obviously see that, I'm going to be very careful about what I say. But remember, too, in the temple, it wasn't just women, but it was women and men who were not allowed into the Holy of Holies. Only the priests were. So the whole idea about some people being allowed to do it and others not would have been very natural to a Judean religion, okay? And would have been seen as something that isn't, we have to remember, we see things from a 21st century sensibility. So we look at it and say, wait a minute, this isn't fair. All people aren't being treated equally. Well, guess what? Most of history was like that, so that's something that really is kind of unique to it's like us wanting to have the history. What do you mean we don't know what happened between this year and that year? We want to know. Inquiring minds want to know. And unfortunately, we don't know. Okay, good questions. I like opening cans of worms. Okay, so how did Paul begin these congregations? Okay, how did he begin these congregations? Because that's what we already said. He's going around to these places that haven't had anything. And it boils down to two things: preaching and conversations. So how to preach conversationally, that way you get them both in, see? Preaching and conversations. Notice these are both oral. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll talk about the letters. But these are both oral things. So let's look at these. If you read Acts, it says very clearly in Acts that Paul first goes to the synagogue when he enters a new city. So if you look at Acts 17, 1 through 10, we're not going to take the time to do that. You'll see that. Also, both Judeans and Gentiles were there. Both were needed to support the synagogue. Okay, remember there were Gentiles who sympathized with what Judeans believed, and they would have also been there as well. When we look at synagogues, though, remember if we're reading Acts, we have to ask the question, could this be something that Luke likes? Does Luke like to put Paul in a synagogue? Well, Luke wants to show the continuity with Judaism, and Paul never really talks about preaching in the synagogue. Also, Paul seems to have a primary mission to the Gentiles, right? And if you want to find Gentiles, you're not going to find the vast majority of them in a synagogue. You're going to find a few, but you're not going to find a vast majority of them. And we can look at Galatians for that, Romans chapter 1, chapter 11, chapter 15. For Paul, the gospel came first to Judeans, and his letters presume a solid understanding of Israel's Bible. So it would make sense to start where a community was gathered. And if you look at 2 Corinthians, there's a passage there where Paul says he ran afoul of the synagogue authorities. So if he ran afoul of them, he must have been near a synagogue. So even though he doesn't state outright that he went to a synagogue, if you look at all of the evidence, it makes sense that that would have been where he would have gone. Now, he's not going to emphasize that because his emphasis is not to the Judeans, but rather to the Gentiles. But you think about it, you already have a group of people there. Acts definitely has it that way, but we have to look at that perhaps other understanding. So this is one of those where Acts says it. In the past, you may have gotten the impression if Acts says it, we're like, oh, no, it must not have happened. It's in Acts, and that's what Luke wants us to believe. But this is one that could make sense. Even though Paul never said that he did this, it would make sense that he would start in synagogues. Because both Judeans and Gentiles who were the God-fearers, they were the sympathizers, people who wanted to learn more about it, not actually become Jewish. Also, Acts talks about Paul preaching for 2 years in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. Also the Agora, the Areopagus, and other Greek places. Again, the problem with these is this has hints of Socrates speaking to the Greek citizens. Okay, doesn't mean he didn't do that, but again, this could be kind of looking at sort of a new Socrates coming on. Paul talks about his own rented lodging. Okay, we talked about how expensive rent was, but doesn't mean he may not have had rented lodging. That's in Acts. And house churches, which is most likely, that when he would have gone around, he would have, the synagogues perhaps, but almost especially the house churches. Okay, as that group got together, as they got off the ground, when he would go back to visit, when he goes the first time, there is no house church. But once he gets it going and they start developing their own house church, when he swings back around the next time, he probably goes directly to the house church because those are the people that he already knows would want to hear what he has to say. What is clear to Paul is preaching is important. Let's see, it says I have some citations. Let me see if there's anything I want to read here. This is a long paragraph, and I don't want to go through it, but there's many, many citations in a lot of Paul's letters where he really does say out how important preaching is to him. I think there was one of these that I did want to talk about, though. No. There are just many, many citations in his letters where he talks about the importance of preaching for him. So let's go on and talk about conversation. His workplace would be a natural place for conversation. Now remember what we said about his workplace last week. He doesn't have one workplace, right? If he's a tent maker, which he probably was, or doing something with leather work, he's packing up his tools and moving on to a new place and setting up a new shop. But as people come into that shop, that's a great place for conversation. Okay, and Paul, I'm sure, was a lot like this missionary I met today who was not shy about talking the gospel, okay, nonstop. Well, how'd you get to Florida? Well, let me tell you what God did. I mean, just the whole conversation was in terms of gospel to this particular person. So his workplace was probably a prime place for him to be able to have conversation. As a tent maker / leather worker, he would have worked long, tedious hours, and he would have had time to talk. In the congested cities with living quarters above shops, his shop would have been like a modern-day neighborhood coffee shop or ice cream parlor. So kind of picture a Starbucks. Okay, that's what he has kind of going on. He's there, and he's in his shop. People come in. He can have conversations with them. And he could have access to entire families, because usually the whole family would come in, so he'd be able to talk to them. Conversations and conversions of entire families or parts of families. That's another reason to believe these conversations would take place, because usually an entire family will come in together. Not always. We have examples of wives and slaves not converting. Again, talking about the women. Okay, the men would be converted, but the wives and slaves, we won't convert them. See the letter of Philemon where Onesimus' master has been baptized, but not Onesimus. Okay, so we have examples where not everybody comes in. In 1 Corinthians, there's an example in chapter 7 where only a husband or a wife converts. So one or the other, but not both. But in most places, it would have been an entire family. The Domus was less public than a rented building, but still it wasn't totally private. Paul had a concern that the Lord's Supper be conducted in a way that brought honor to the Christ-believing community and showed the world the positive sibling relationships in the church. So in 1 Corinthians 14, he talks about his concern for speaking in tongues in front of non-believers. They might get the wrong idea. Rather, preaching would do more good for them rather than doing something like that. So he is more interested in the witness of believers to non-believers, so being on your best behavior in these conversations. So you get the idea of preaching to a larger group and also individual conversations with people or with entire families. Those were the two main modes that Paul would have used to spread this good news. This is a quote from Roger Gehring, who says, "These houses played an important role in the context of Paul's evangelistic ministry by naturally opening the door to a whole network of relationships. Householders were able to create an immediate audience for Paul by inviting their friends, relatives, and clientele. Within a very short time after becoming a guest in someone's home, Paul had a relatively large number of high-quality contacts for one-on-one conversations in his evangelistic meetings." So he would come into these places, and it was a natural place for him to have conversations. And you can just basically see in his personality type that these are the things he just lived on. He just loved having these kinds of abilities to be able to talk to people. Okay, how did Paul nurture congregations? And this is where we're going to spend the remainder of our time. Most of it is going to be on these four things. A, personal visits. B, sending his associates, including female associates, to visit. C, writing letters. We're going to spend the most time on that, since that's kind of where we're headed to when we begin our new semester. And then D, this monetary collection from his basically Gentile congregations to give to the Judean Christ believers in Jerusalem. So we're going to look at these four ways of how Paul nurtured his congregations. So again, picture what Paul's doing. He's going to a new place. He is getting these people together. He's preaching the gospel. A core group of them form a church, and then he moves on to another place. They do the same thing. He keeps moving. Eventually, he's going to come back to these places as well, or communicate with them in one of these ways. So let's look at personal visits first. Paul was a frequent flyer. Okay, not in our terms of what it means to be a frequent flyer in 21st century terms, but he was without a question a frequent walker and ship passenger. He had a restless energy that brought him not only to new places, but to return to places where he had founded congregations. So he not only would found it, but he would find himself going back to it as well. So it wasn't a one and done for him. He didn't go somewhere and start it and keep moving on. We do have some gaps, and we don't know. When Acts of the Apostles ends, there he is, you don't know what happened. I mean, the big question, did he ever make it to Spain? He wanted to go to Spain. Again, it would be great to have a letter that would show that, but where all did he go? But we do know that he was definitely a frequent flyer. He did understand the powerful effect that his sheer presence could have on a group of believers. He speaks in Galatians 4 and 2 Corinthians 10 and in 2 Corinthians 13 that he wishes he could be present. So when he's not there, he can even write saying, "I wish I could be there with you." Now, again, early on, I'm sure there was a lot of concern about him coming because of the reputation he had as a persecutor. But once that kind of wore off and everyone saw that he did indeed have their best interest, then his sheer presence could have, just imagine it. It'd be like if the presiding bishop were going to come visit us. It would be a great event. Even if our own bishop comes, we have a big event, everyone comes. So Paul coming would have been kind of like that. Okay, this is the biggest personality you have in the early church who could come and visit you. He exercised his power in an ironic way because remember we said last week, Paul embodied the power and the weakness of his Lord. To him, power came not in power, but it came in weakness. He talks about this in Galatians and 2 Corinthians. But also, he knew there were times that his presence didn't always solve problems. And I do want to look at this passage. This is 2 Corinthians 2. So 2 Corinthians chapter 2. It's been a while since we've opened these up, so. Second Corinthians 2, verses 1 and 2. So he says here in 2 Corinthians 2, verses 1 and 2, "So I made up my mind that I would not make another painful visit to you. For if I grieve you, who is left to make me glad but you whom I have grieved?" Well, it was a painful visit, so he does understand that there are some times when his coming there actually can be a painful experience. He wasn't always the most praising of people, so there could be times when his coming was kind of like being told you had to go to the principal's office. And only in this case, instead of going to the principal's office, the principal's going to come to your house and visit you. So sometimes that could be good. Maybe they're there to talk about what a wonderful student you were, but it may not always be that. So there were times when Paul realized his presence might actually make things worse rather than better. Okay. I have a little cartoon here. She says, "You should have called first, giving me a chance to not be home." So, there were some congregations that might have preferred to have this with Paul. "I wish you would let us know you were coming. We would have been gone." Secondly, visits by Paul's associates. He uses the Greek term synergos, which means co-worker, but it's actually, co-worker to us sounds almost blasé. It sounds not as close and personal as this would have been to Paul. These were really more like an associate, somebody that you took in your confidence. So when Paul used the term co-worker, he intended it to be a title of some honor and was reserved for his closest associates. In Romans, you have Priscilla and Aquila, right? There we have a woman. We have Urbanus. We have Timothy in Romans. We have Apollos. We have Titus. We have Clement. We have Philemon. We have Luke and Mark. There's a lot of these people that he mentions. I could go on and on. I have about 20 names listed here, but I'm not going to take the time to read them all. And also all the different passages. But he speaks of them. And he doesn't speak of them just as being someone who are sort of a casual co-worker, but they're his associate. They're working side by side with him. Barnabas was significant early on, but they split over eating with Gentile believers and the use of Mark. So that's one where he had a close associate, but then there's some friction that actually creates them to sever that bond. Similarly, although a different form of the word was used, it probably also included Mary in Romans, not that Mary, but another Mary, and a couple of other people as well. So there are several people that he mentions using some kind of a term that makes it clear that these were close personal associates of his. We have Titus in Corinth. He was valuable for Paul in Corinth, where there were significant problems. That's why it was really important to have a good associate in Corinth. Things didn't go smoothly in Corinth all the time. And so he needed somebody there that he could trust. He probably delivered the long-lost letter of tears from Paul, which was a massive attack on the Corinthians that is mentioned in 2 Corinthians 2, 1-11. Titus eventually tells Paul that the letter and his ministry did some good. So let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 7. I think this is the longest passage we're going to read tonight. I just couldn't let go of this one. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. And we're actually going to read from verse 5 all the way down to 16. So we're going to read 11 verses of this. So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 7, 5-16. Paul says, "For when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, fears within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. You thought he was going to say Jesus, right? By the coming. No, he says the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort you had given him. He told us about your longing for me, your deep sorrow, your ardent concern for me, so that my joy was greater than ever. Even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, okay, this is the letter of tears that we'd love to be able to see, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, I see that my letter hurt you, but only for a little while. Yet now I am happy, not because you were made sorry, but because your sorrow led you to repentance. For you became sorrowful as God intended, and so were not harmed in any way by us. Godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation and leaves no regret, but worldly sorrow brings death. See what this godly sorrow has produced in you, what earnestness, what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what alarm, what longing, what concern, what readiness to see justice done. At every point you have proved yourselves to be innocent in this matter. So even though I wrote to you, it was neither on account of the one who did the wrong, nor on account of the injured party, but rather that before God you could see for yourselves how devoted to us you are. By all this we are encouraged. In addition to our encouragement, we were especially delighted to see how happy Titus was, because his spirit has been refreshed by all of you. I had boasted to him about you, and you have not embarrassed me. But just as everything we said to you is true, so our boasting about you to Titus has proved to be true as well. And his affection for you is all the greater when he remembers that you were all obedient, receiving him with fear and trembling. I am glad I can have complete confidence in you. So there was a problem, right? Things were not going well. But somehow through Titus, things are now made better. And so you can see, first of all, the importance of Titus in resolving this whole situation. And Paul's putting a positive spin on this, you know. Hey, this wasn't the worldly sorrow that brings death. This was heavenly sorrow. This is going to make things better. So be glad you felt sorry, because it led you to repentance. In Thessalonica, we have Timothy and Silvanus. Also, Acts adds Silas there as well. Many women assisted Paul. Of the women assisting Paul, Phoebe is particular note because she would have lived in Rome, and so she probably took the letter to the Romans. Not only was she a patron of many people, including Paul, but she not only delivered the letter to the Romans, but probably read it and explained it to them as well. We're going to talk about that with letters in a minute. So when she came, she did more than deliver the letter. She would have read it to them and also told them what Paul really meant. So again, we go back to the role of women. That would have been a very important role. She's actually coming there really representing Paul. She's more than just a woman coming there. She's actually explaining to them what Paul would have meant. I think I have one more thing that I wanted to say here. His network between himself and his congregation was two-way. Paul's co-workers also reported back to him how things were going. I think we saw that in that little blurb there about Titus, that it was a two-way street. So it isn't Paul just sending a lieutenant out to do it. They come back. There's a two-way conversation. So that's where you get the idea they're more than just a co-worker. They're a true associate who are doing this along with him. Okay, letters. This is where we're going to spend a good amount of time kind of previewing some of the things we're going to talk about when we get into the individual letters early next year. Like with associates, these allowed Paul to deal with the impossibility of being everywhere. He couldn't be everywhere, and I can imagine as he started churches and moved on and started churches, he was constantly worrying about what was going on. Especially like in Corinth, the word came back to him that there were issues that were going on in that church. So his way of being able to be there was to write a letter. In antiquity, letters were designed to overcome the geographical and chronological distances between people. It was the fiction of personal presence. To them, a letter was a personal presence. You know, I'm taking communion to somebody right now weekly who has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. We were talking about when he was in the service, the letters he wrote to his wife, and she saved every one of the letters. And I'm sure you all have letters from people that are very important too. And I just worry, what's the next generation going to have? Are they going to save the text messages or the emails? Or, You know, it was such an important way to be able to save these things. In antiquity, letters were supremely important, kind of the way they would have been for us growing up, saving these kinds of letters. So writing letters was not only socially acceptable, but it was very necessary of a way to be present somewhere where you couldn't be. And most people couldn't read, so why would you write a letter? Well, you would write a letter to someone who would read it, and that way you could hear Paul's voice from the person who read the letter to the group. So again, if we go back to Phoebe or any of the other people who delivered the letter were more than a messenger. They were actually Paul's presence there, reading it and trying to give it the same meaning that Paul had. Okay? I hope you see how important that role was, because that's something that would be much different for us. We can deliver a letter and read it. Those people couldn't read, so this person came representing Paul and reading this letter, and Paul had probably talked with them about what this letter had in it and what he wanted to be emphasized. And so that person would read it in a way that they could emphasize that. Actually, sometimes seen by Paul as preferred to the physical presence. No surprise, that's in 2 Corinthians, where we've already seen him talk about the fact that his being there was painful. So if he can't be there personally, then it's better to write a letter. So he does say that in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. The challenge for us in later centuries is that we're missing the other side of the conversation. Okay, again, it's like reading all letters from one person without seeing the responses from the other person. Yeah, question back there?
Did he make copies?
What's that?
Did he make copies, or was there only one letter that had to be shared?
Typically, we'll find out later on, there were sometimes people sent 2 letters because there was great risk that your letter wouldn't arrive. So if you had money, you would do 2 letters, but chances are there was just 1 letter, okay? He didn't have his photocopier to be able to do that, so it was probably 1 letter. Rich people, like I said, would have done 2 letters, sending them by 2 different messengers in case one gets attacked and killed, then the other letter would get there, because they didn't have any kind of certainty that a letter would arrive. So, yeah, that's our challenge, is we're seeing the one side, and sometimes, you know, we get a sense that Paul wrote the letter, something came back to him, and then he writes another letter, because we have more than 1 letter to a couple places, and you get a sense that something happened, but we never really see that. You know, it would have been great to have some kind of correspondence from, for example, when Phoebe did take the letter to Rome, if there was something in writing she brought back as to how they responded to that letter when they got it. Letter writing, not only antiquity, but is extremely popular in the 1st century, because by now we have a huge empire. Now we have this huge Roman Empire, and so as people try to communicate, especially with the government is sending letters out all over the empire to be able to get, and that's what, yeah, the size of the Roman Empire. Throughout this empire, so if the emperor wants to get the word out, then a letter has to be sent to all parts of the empire so that that can be made known. That's the only way to communicate, really, at that time. Letter had become an art form in the hands of sophisticated authors like Cicero and Seneca. Cicero died only 40 years before Paul's birth, and Seneca was a contemporary of Paul. So they were, and we're going to talk about the art form of the letter, because Paul didn't just haphazardly write letters. Kind of like when we learned to write, we were told that there are certain parts of it. We're going to see there were parts of these letters as well. So these 2 guys right here, Cicero and Seneca, had really perfected the art form of what the letter would be. Of the 27 New Testament documents, 21 are written more or less in letter format. And I'm including in that Acts, because Acts contains letters, in chapter 15 and chapter 23. And Revelation even has within it 7 letters, chapters 2 and chapters 8. So even in books of the New Testament that we don't think of as being letter books, there's still letters as part of them. Late 1st century and early 2nd century were letter writers. Ignatius of Antioch, he wrote many letters. 1st and 2nd Clement, apocryphal letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, the epistle of Barnabas, these are all apocryphal, but they're still letters. So, and letters after Paul, but still letter writing. They're not included in our canon, but it doesn't take away the fact that those were letters, which was a popular way of writing. Something about the nature of early Christianity made it a movement of letter writers. That's what Stanley Stower says. Kind of a interesting quote there. Because of the popularity of the letter and the dry climate of the Mediterranean basin, we have thousands of letters from antiquity. Some have been around since antiquity. Many others are everyday business and personal letters that have literally been unearthed in modern times from garbage heaps or from the ruins of homes. Since we have so many letters, we can see how Paul's letters and his use of things like rhetoric are similar to or different from the style of other letters in the world at that same time. So with that in mind, we're going to spend a big chunk of time here on the components of letters. We're going to look at letter as a genre. We're going to look at the structure of a letter. We're going to look at the use of rhetoric, which Paul was an expert at. Forms and traditions for constructing Paul's thoughts. And then finally, the production and delivery of these letters. So these are the 5 things we're going to look at under letters. I told you this is where we're going to spend most of our time, is under letters. So first of all, if we look at the genre, this is the way Galatians was sent, by the way. We can see the stamp has been canceled, so it's... The question that used to be asked was, are these epistles or are they letters? An epistle is a literary essay in letter format meant for public consumption. That's what an epistle would be. So in other words, it's a public letter, whereas a letter is an everyday non-literary communication meant for private use only. So for a long time it was argued, are these epistles or are they letters? And you can go to a church, it will say a reading from the epistle of Paul to the whatever. Or they might say a reading from the letter of Paul. Are they synonymous? Well, we already said they're not synonymous. But later research has basically said they really were both. It isn't a matter of whether it was an epistle or a letter, but they're really combining the two. Because although they weren't meant in general for public consumption, on one level, they were private. I mean, the letter to the Romans was meant for the Romans, not for the Corinthians, so they were meant for one place. But they were to be read aloud, because as we already said, people couldn't read. So in that sense, they were public. So they really have pieces of both an epistle and a letter. And so what many scholars who are scholars lately would say, let's not waste our time on arguing whether it's an epistle or a letter. It's both. It really kind of ticks off the marks of all of those. The official nature of Paul's letter, exercising his authority as an apostle, is designed to be read in public. Just like the Greco-Roman, those letters from the Roman Empire that was originally the Greek Empire, they're official administrative letters from rulers to subordinates. Those letters would have been taken to the town square and then read to everybody. So those letters were not meant to just be in private. And Paul's letters were pretty much the same way. Let's see here. What's interesting is, even though Paul's letters had the warmth of a salutation that made it sound like a personal letter, some of the beginning of his letters are very personal. You know, like us writing a personal note to someone. Even with a very personal introduction, it still was meant to be read in public. In sum, Paul's letters are hybrids that resist one precise categorization. Both Paul's authority and his sophisticated arguments and biblical interpretation, while revealing an intimacy built on common experience and common devotion to the same Lord. All right, let's look at the structure of Paul's letters. This isn't necessarily it, just a picture of what a structure of a letter would look like. That was in the textbook Paul used when he was in elementary school.
What makes us think those letters were meant to be read aloud?
What's that?
What makes us think that the letters were meant to be read aloud?
Because most people in the audience wouldn't have been able to read. And so since they would not have been able to read, they would have to be read aloud. And especially if you're in a place where you're drawing people from all over the city, both people with resources and people without, you would certainly have a sizable number of people in your church who wouldn't be able to read. And so hearing that letter aloud would have been something really important.
Well, would the subject be specific to that group? Like
Absolutely.
The Romans or the Corinthians? Okay.
The question was, would the letter have been specific to that audience? And in that sense, it's like a private letter, like a letter, because when he's writing to Corinth, he is talking about issues for Corinth. When he's writing to Rome, he's talking about issues for Rome. Now, there's similarities to all of them. He's preaching this gospel of Jesus, so there are certain things he's going to say to every church that he writes. But he's typically addressing something going on, okay, that's going on in that church at that time. Okay, so the salutation would have been first. The greeting includes, in order, the name of the sender, the name of the person being addressed, and a greeting. Letters in antiquity usually say greetings. Paul adopted but changed in two ways, using Greek for grace and for peace. Also, Paul's salutation often contains a clue to Paul's argument that's going to come up later on in the body. So sometimes he kind of would tip his hat as part of this salutation. Okay? But you know it's a salutation if you see the word greetings. The second piece was the thanksgiving. And this was really big for Paul. Immediately after the salutation, Paul would give thanks to God for the addressees and or some other gift of God. I daily give thanks to you for blah, 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 whatever it was he was going to say. So as soon as he's done the salutation, he goes into some kind of a thanksgiving. Also, in some of his letters, this is where he gives a clue to the basic intent of the letter, the reason he is writing it to them. In one letter, Galatians, he omits the thanksgiving, which probably was saying something to that church, and they probably would have known that they were in hot water because he didn't do the thanksgiving. So if that was missing from a letter, they would expect to hear the thanksgiving. They'd say, uh-oh, this is not going to be good. So you're hearing it, and the thanksgiving is gone. Okay, again, being called to the principal. Next is the body of the letter. This would be Paul's major arguments on behalf of the thesis of the letter, whatever his reason for writing it. There was great variation in how Paul put together the bodies of his letters, since the life situations of the listeners and the issues to be addressed varied widely. They could be quite long. In Romans, the body of the letter goes from chapter 1, verse 18, all the way to chapter 11, verse 36. So the body could be very long or could be very short, depending on what he wants to address. This is where he uses a lot of the devices he used here, where we realize that he was a very educated person, because he uses some very interesting techniques in the way he wrote. All of his letters don't sound alike. He uses lots of different critical techniques whenever he's writing these. Then there was an ethical section, also called paranesis. And in this one, he could have ethical comments anywhere in his letter, but this was a particular section of the letter towards the end, a full section devoted to ethical instruction, or paranesis, which is advice. So this is, as he's getting to the end of the letter, he gives either ethical instructions of what they're expected to do, and then finally there was the conclusion. One or more of these items: a peace wish, it could be greetings again, it could be a laundry list of instructions and or a benediction. He has some beautiful benedictions at the end of some of his letters that we still use to this day. And a good example there is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, 12 to 28, which I don't have circled, so that means we're not reading it. Okay, number 3, rhetoric. Of all of the devices that Paul used, this is the only one I really want to pick out, because there's so many things we could talk about what he does. You know, use of so many different, I don't know, Anita, what it would be called, literary devices maybe, or something like that. His use of rhetoric. And rhetoric is the disciplined art of persuasion. Did anybody ever participate in your debate team when you were in high school? Anyone in here? Okay, didn't you coach debate once? Yeah. So some of the things that we see with rhetoric are the way you would teach a debate team how to argue their topic. It was a very structured way of approaching your argument. At his time, most students were taught the art of rhetoric by age 12, and if you were a gifted student, then you kept learning rhetoric all the way up to age 18. Today, we'd say you learn math, and then if you're really gifted, you go on to take calculus and advanced math. Back then, if you were gifted, you were taught more rhetoric to teach you how to be more persuasive. Handbooks have been found back to the 4th century BCE of how this was taught. So we know that this was something that was quite prevalent as far as how to teach children how to use rhetoric. Oral rhetoric and letter rhetoric were seen as the same because, again, almost all letters were read out loud. So there was little difference between the written and oral form of rhetoric. So whenever you read Paul's letters, they really are meant to be read out loud. You have to listen to what it is to be able to hear the argument. 1st and 2nd centuries CE, or Common Era, or after Christ, public performances were like our rock concerts. So when you got together to have a letter read, it was a big deal. So you can picture if somebody came to town with one of Paul's letters, that was big. We're going to gather everyone together, okay, and we're going to all come together to hear this letter read. I repeated a cartoon that I had a little earlier. The guy at the computer saying, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides, it's time to do my own research on the real truth. Goes to Google and it says literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe, and he says, jackpot. Unfortunately, that's not the way to do rhetoric. To do rhetoric, you learn both sides. Yeah. Peg, Mike.
If they had large gatherings to listen to Paul's letter being read or whatever, after, I don't know, 5, 6, 8 minutes after they've read this, did they continue the conversation on these letters? Because these letters are not ready, would be a very short rock concert.
Well, and that's why, again, wouldn't it be great to know what happened afterwards? It'd be wonderful to have a report of what the discussion was. I wish someone was there to take the minutes. And then Phoebe being given a copy of those minutes and take them back to Paul, and then they're filed away. That would be so wonderful to know, how were they received? Did some people listen to the letters and say, well, I can't believe he's saying that about us? Doesn't he realize how hard we're trying to do this or that? It's very possible. We're hearing this one side of the conversation, and that is a bit frustrating. Continuing on with rhetoric, the parts of a letter or speech for rhetoricians. First of all is the exordium. This sets forth the ethos of the speaker, and he tries to get he or she, at the time probably a he, would try to get the listeners on their side. So you start off right outside the gate trying to get them on your side. The second part, the narratio, this is where you state and clarify the issue to be discussed. This might be like what you did with your debate team. I would think this is probably standard approach to how you would get people to debate a topic. Next, the propositio would be the thesis of the speech or the letter. The probatio, this is where the speaker or the author tries to prove the proposition. Okay, so this is what I want to prove, and this is how I'm going to prove it. And then this is what's sadly lacking so often now when we debate things. What do you think this means? Refute. This is anticipating what your opponent's arguments are going to be and addressing them. Okay? You conclude the speech, or no, excuse me. This attacks the arguments of the opponent, and the rejected arguments may be anticipated or actual. So even if someone hasn't made a refutation, or you would anticipate what it would be, and you address this. And then finally, you conclude the speech or the letter with an emotional appeal summarizing the major arguments and asking for the listener's assent. I think the main thing that you see here is it's both point and counterpoint. You not only make your point, but you also address whatever. And Paul uses this to great advantage in his letters. Continuing on, created various modes to appeal to different aspects of the listener's minds and emotions. Some of these words are going to sound familiar to you. Ethos. This appeals to the person's character, okay, as to why they should believe you. Show you have character. Believe me, okay? Pathos. Appeal to your emotions. Some arguments, a good argument should use all of these, okay? But we know that an appeal to emotion can be very, very effective. And lastly, logos. Reason. Appeal to the listener's reason. So a good, well-developed rhetorical argument not only has all those parts, but also addresses the character, the emotions, and the reason of a person. Again, something I think that's missing these days. We tend to hear arguments based on one or the other, especially emotions. A lot of arguments based on emotion, and without addressing all parts of the person. Again, I have all kinds of passages on those, but we don't have the time. Aristotle had three different kinds of rhetorical argument. There was judicial rhetoric. Guess where that was used? Court. And that would have been an argument based on things from the past. There was deliberative rhetoric. That was making an argument based on things that would happen in the future. And then there was epidictic rhetoric, which is based on things from the present. I had descriptions of each of those, but I'm not going to take the time to read them. I just want you to see that rhetoric is not just a simple thing. You can slice and dice this many ways when you're talking about rhetoric. And then I have a cartoon here. We have a student handing in his test. It says on the board test today, and he said, "I didn't feel answers were necessary. All the questions seem rhetorical." So good luck trying that. But okay, number 4. Forms and traditions for constructing his thoughts. And this is, again, looking at the forms and traditions that would have been available for Paul at that time. The Greco-Roman, the original Greek society that had become Roman, and the things from that society. We talked a little bit about paranesis earlier. Paranesis is an ethical exhortation or instruction about how to live and not to live. It's usually traditional, reflecting typical ethical commands from the culture, as well as adaptations by the church. 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians has this in it. Based on the Greek letter chi, C-H-I, or the X, we have chiasm. This is using 2 or more terms stated then repeated in reverse order. Paul uses this a lot, and I had several of them to read, but he might talk about men and women, and all of a sudden he turns it around, it's women and men. So it's using the same things but reversing the order. That, again, is a rhetorical approach used in constructing his thoughts. I was going to read some diatribe, but again, we don't have the time to do that. The diatribe is question and answer with an imaginary opponent. You ask the question, and then you give an answer, but there's not really anybody there. You just keep asking the questions. And I had a great passage that I was going to read from Romans 3. You might just jot down Romans 3. Literally, one verse is a question or a couple of questions, and the next verse is the answer. And then Romans chapter 3. Literally, a question followed by an answer, another question followed by an answer, another question followed by an answer. Okay, that would be a diatribe. And then another thing that Paul loved to do, and we read one of these last week, we're not going to do this, the peristasis. This is hardship catalogs followed by ways in which the wise man or the apostle endures and overcomes. 2 Corinthians 11, we read last week, that's where he says, I was shipwrecked this many times, I was beaten this many times, I had this, I had a callus on my foot, this happened, and he just goes on and on and on with all the hardships. Okay, and then basically says, suck it up, because that's what's going to happen to you if you're a follower of Jesus. So those were from the Greco-Roman. From Judean forms and traditions, or in other words, from Israel, we have some of these things. Midrash has 2 components, a quote from Israel's Bible and an interpretation of that. So this is where he would take a quote from something from what we would consider to be the Old Testament, and how has that been fulfilled now in Jesus? That's what Midrash would be. Analogy. Similar laws, similar verdicts. This connects statements that share the same word. And this is really interesting because this missionary I was with today used this very thing from curse, where Paul uses a word like curse from Deuteronomy and turns it right around and applies it to the curse of Jesus on the cross. So it's using a term that would have been used in the Old Testament and finding a way to use that exact same term and looking at the life of Jesus. Typology. This is using a correspondence or an anti-correspondence between an earlier event or a person. And the best example here is referring to Jesus as the new Adam. You have the old Adam, now you have the new Adam. You had the old covenant and the new covenant. So it's kind of taking an old concept and updating it for what it meant with Jesus. And then we had the apocalyptic, and we've talked about that. We know this was in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, and Paul may or may not have known about that. But his apocalyptic application is widespread in his writing. He takes events from Israel's Bible and uses them to talk about why we're looking at, and we have the emerging church traditions. So first of all, confessional statements. I'm not talking about something as sophisticated as the Augsburg Confession or even the Nicene Creed. I'm talking about very, very quick kinds of things. So the briefest is in Romans 10:9 when Paul refers to Jesus Lord. Right? That right there is a confessional statement, saying that this Jesus is Lord. I was going to read 1 Corinthians 15. I'm not going to go through that, where I am passing on to you what I've heard, and that again is a brief creed. Baptismal formulas. He uses in Romans and Galatians baptismal language that may have come from baptismal liturgies that were already starting to develop at that time. And I so wish that we had time to read this. I love reading Paul about what happened at the Lord's Supper, because these are the earliest words. So anytime you read it, you have to realize this is long before anyone wrote anything. That I pass on to you what I learned, that the Lord Jesus, the night he was betrayed, took bread, he broke it, he gave it to his disciples and said, take this and eat it. We hear it every week, but that actually comes way, way back to Paul. Paul was actually the first one to use those words. Blessings and doxologies. There's plenty of blessings and doxologies that Paul uses. Early hymns and poems. One of the best hymns is probably Philippians chapter 2. Though Jesus was in the form of God, he did not deem equality with God. This is probably an ancient hymn, and his letters are full of things that could have been. And then catechetical material, again, very early catechetical. We're not talking about anything that's in a developed form yet. But ways for massive teaching, the early church. 1 Thessalonians has that in chapter 4. And again, anytime he refers to words of the Lord, is he talking about the earthly Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, about a prophet speaking in the name of Jesus? Okay, I'm keeping my eye on the clock here because I want to get through all this. Okay, the production and delivery. Paul's letters were almost certainly written by a secretary, because secretaries typically would have written letters. It was a widespread practice in the first century by government and private authors alike. Romans 16:22 even says, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter. That tells you right there it's not Paul writing it. And also evidence at the end of letters that he has. At the end of a letter, like in 1 Corinthians, there's a change in handwriting and evidence that Paul is writing now, so sometimes it may have looked like Paul picked up the pen to actually write the conclusion. How much did Paul compose versus the secretaries? We could talk about that to a great deal, but because Paul felt it was so important, there were some secretaries who the writer would just say, here, I want you to talk about this, and they would write it. Paul most certainly did not do that. He would have probably dictated it word for word, because the wording would have been very important to him. Although Paul seems to have controlled writing his letters, he refers to several co-senders. 5 of the undisputed letters refer to co-senders. In Galatians, he includes with himself all the brothers and sisters who are with me. So we talked about co-workers earlier. We also get an idea that there are co-senders. So Paul's not like a monk writing a letter in a cell. There's lots of conversations with co-believers that are going into this. So even his letters were probably not just the product of his mind. So here's young Paul writing an epistle from camp. He says, Paulie, a kid, called to be a camper, set apart for archery and crafts, to the parents gathered in the hometown. Greetings, I give thanks daily for the cookies you sent. I count all my poison ivy as loss. So this one, by the way, hasn't been discovered yet, but if it was, that's what it would sound like. Who delivered Paul's letters? Certainly not Paul. Okay, we've already talked about some of the people who did it. Here are some of the names here. Titus and question mark, we don't know who the second person would have been. For 2 Corinthians 8 and perhaps even more, we talked about the letter of tears. There's Phoebe. So this is kind of repeating some of the stuff that we talked about earlier. Okay, Onesimus there with Philemon. We talked earlier a little bit about this. The odds of a letter being received were not great because of robbery, illness, accidents, etc. Wealthier people often sent 2 letters by different carriers just to ensure that one of them was going to arrive. Once received, the letter needed to be read aloud since most people could not read. And growing consensus that the deliverer was also the reader. So, for example, Phoebe taking that letter, she would have been the reader.
And then what happened to the letter?
Who knows? It went somewhere and it was found, it was kept because it's in our canon. So somebody, so it obviously didn't just get thrown away. That's how it was delivered right there. Okay, let me talk just briefly about the pen. Would have been a reed pen. Okay. Looking something like this. So it was a reed cut to be able to do it, and you had to keep whittling it down to keep using it. The ink was black ink, which was typically taken from the inside of chimneys. It was turned into bricks, and then those bricks were wet, and then you could use that. The red ink came from, let's see, where'd the red ink came from? I think it came from from red iron oxide, the red ink. The paper would have been papyrus. The desk would have been none. And mistakes, the secretary would erase it with a damp sponge and then write it again. And then finally, I don't want to spend a lot of time because we're actually a little bit over time here, but the fourth way Paul built a network of believers was by taking the collection from the Gentile collections, designed to be a gift from them to the church in Jerusalem. You speak about it in 1 Corinthians 16. There are several citations about whether this is a service that's being done or a ministry being done. It was probably both. It also was a way of expressing fellowship. And finally, it was a way of, several citations. I thought unity was up there. Unity must be on the next slide. Yeah, Genesis of the gift was the apostolic council. That's where they divided the mission between Peter and Paul, and they basically said Paul would be taking up the collection and bringing it back to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem leaders asked Paul to remember the poor, which according to Galatians 2, Paul was eager to do. And why would he have spent so many years and so much effort on the collections, relief for the poor? Reciprocal giving. We give you money, we expect something back from you. Challenge to Jerusalem authorities to tell them if they were not keeping up with what the Council of Jerusalem said to do, they were keeping their part. That's a challenge to Jerusalem to do what they agreed they would do. They're a symbol of unity. And I think that probably was one of the most important things for Paul, to show that we're all in this together. We're going to take care of our brothers and sisters no matter where they are. And there's no time for study questions. Any quick questions? Because we're already 3 minutes over. If you do, ask me afterwards. That's right. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. You all have a wonderful end of Advent and a Merry Christmas. I'm not supposed to say it yet because it's still Advent, but have it anyway.